On the left-hand side of the screen, we have the RX 9060 XT 16GB version represented by the Asus Prime model for AMD up against its closest price competitor in Nvidia's lineup. This is the 5060 Ti 8GB version because that's the one that's the closest price competitor. We should probably actually talk about pricing before we go any further in the video because the pricing is what's going to make all the difference on whether this is a good graphics card or not. So let's look at a couple of things. So why compare against the 5060 Ti 8GB? Isn't that unfair? Well, here's the thing. I think most people buy a graphics card within a certain budget range. For example, somebody looking at the 9060 XT 16GB might be wanting the best graphics card under $400. Well, the 5060 Ti 8GB is available for a little under $400. Whereas if I wanted the 16GB version, at least in the United States, the lowest price available is $480. It's a completely different price class. Now, will the 9060 XT end up actually hitting its MSRP of $350? Well, if it's anything like the 9070 launch, it's gonna probably be available for that on launch day. I would hope it would then continue to be available at that price afterwards, but that has not been the case with AMD's 9070 launch for their 9070 or 9070 XT. Things have been significantly above MSRP. That being said, even if this ends up $30 to $50 over its MSRP, that would still put it in the $400 or under range, making the 5060 Ti 8GB version the closest price competitor. Now, if we went down to the 5060 non-Ti, that's a $300 card, and AMD should have a 8GB version of their 9060 XT available at that price. However, they didn't send me a review sample. Now, I asked them, are you not shipping review samples? Because, like, Nvidia, for example, didn't ship 8GB 5060 Ti's. I bought this one so that I could have it available for comparisons like this. And AMD said that they weren't exactly banning samples for the 8GB version, but that they weren't focusing them on my region. So make of that what you will. I also reached out to a bunch of board partners, and they basically gave the same response, which is they weren't interested, like they weren't doing samples for the 8GB models, but they were never instructed by AMD not to sample them. It just wasn't something they were producing a lot of to sample. So anyway, I will, if it looks like 9060 XT 8GB versions are on sale in the United States, I will try to buy one and then run it through these same tests and produce future content, because that's the card that I would like to compare against the 5060, because that's meant to be its direct price competitor. Either way, I'm gonna tell you right now, my conclusion would probably be spend the extra $50 if that's really what the difference is to get the 16GB model. But anyway, that's what's going on with pricing, which is why I'm comparing these videos. Now I'll have separate head-to-head content comparing against things like the 5060 Ti 16GB version. I did do the tests, that will come out. But really that's gonna be, should you spend way more money on the Nvidia card, at least if AMD is anywhere close to MSRP. So that's why we're focusing on the 8GB comparison, which is why when I show you a graph like this, it should explain what you're seeing. This is the percentage difference between the two GPUs. This is not the frame rate numbers, it's the percentage difference. So also I've assigned a positive value to when the 9060 XT is winning, and I've assigned a negative value for when the 5060 Ti 8GB is winning. So for example, if you see, now 0 is right here. So if you're seeing a 0, that means that there is no performance difference between the two cards. So this is the midline, right? So anything to the left of the midline is a win for the 5060 Ti 8GB, and the number next to it it's the percentage it won by. By the way, you can pinch to zoom. I ran a lot of benchmarks. On the right-hand side, the numbers indicate the percentage that the 9060 XT won by. And you might be like, there's massive numbers here. It's 174% faster, 200% faster, and the answer is yes, when the 5060 Ti 8GB is spilling over VRAM. And also, we should then think about, but are those settings that are spilling over VRAM actually usable settings? Because it's kind of a meaningless result if it's at settings that didn't actually perform well. Which is what the side-by-side footage is for. But also before we jump into that, maybe I should mention, so what are all of these tests? There's a bunch of stuff here, but you'll notice some of the same tests are run more than once. And how did I decide what games to test? So I've been focusing my review this time around on the newest games of 2025. So every game you see tested here was released in the year 2025. Now, why am I focusing on that? Because if you want to buy a graphics card and hang on to it for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, which is actually pretty typical. I don't think 4 to 6 years is at all uncommon. You want to know how is it performing in the very newest games? Because if you're buying a game 3 or 4 years from now, it's likely going to perform worse than the ones that just came out. Now, I know that older games are still very popular, and that's still absolutely a valid thing to test. But if you're buying a card for the long term, it's best to know how does it perform in the latest games. And the reality of the situation is the latest games mostly use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM unless you turn down graphic settings. And that's what we're seeing in this crazy swing on this chart. Anyway, but again, does it matter if the cards aren't powerful enough anyway? And I will break this down into a whole bunch of other stats towards the end, but for now, let's jump into the side-by-sides and focus on a few things. One thing we want to focus on here is the actual frame rate numbers we're running at, which I'll be typing here for the averages and also the 1% lows, because is this an acceptable frame rate anyway? The other thing we might want to look at is image quality differences, because I will be testing out things like DLSS and FSR if they're available. At 1080p resolution, I will test native 1080p and native 1440p, but I will also I will test maximum graphic settings, and I'm also going to test medium graphic settings. Also at 1080p, I will test quality level upscaling, and at 1440p, I will also test balanced mode upscaling, because I think those are realistic use cases. And let's check, do we hit usable frame rates under any of these conditions? Let's start with the most popular game of 2025. This is Monster Hunter Wilds. At 1080p maximum settings, this is ultra with RT set to high, the 9060 XT is able to average 57 FPS. It is absolutely able to handle this game at maximum settings at frame rates that are perfectly playable. This is not using any form of upscaling, it's native 1080p. And the 5060 Ti is crushed at 22 FPS. This is 159% advantage for the 9060 XT. Not because it's 159% more powerful in its GPU grunt and horsepower, but because it just simply has enough VRAM. The 5060 Ti doesn't, and actually if I pause it here, in addition to the performance issues, one reason I show side-by-sides is, look, there's actual textures here. Hey, look, those textures are completely missing. This is one of the issues you see with the when a card runs out of VRAM. So this is absolutely a situation where the 9060 XT is powerful enough to run the game at its maximum graphics settings with no issues, and the 5060 Ti would have to turn down graphics settings. Now, is turning down the rendering resolution enough? In other words, well, I'd use DLSS quality anyway, and that lowers the resolution and therefore the VRAM usage. And that's true. This did get the 5060 Ti up to 42 FPS. But using quality level FSR, and the FSR4 is available in this game, so we're fairly comparable image quality-wise here. The 9060 XT is still 57% faster because, frankly, we're still going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And while the average frame rates have improved for the 5060 Ti, look at the frame time graph. It's very stuttery, which we can also see here in the 1% lows. The 1% lows here are 49 versus 18. It's a massive difference, and once again, the textures are still missing on the right-hand side of the screen. So things are not looking good for the 5060 Ti here. But you don't necessarily need to play at maximum settings. So what if instead you're playing at medium settings? Well, now notice that the 5060 Ti is doing just fine. If we play at 1080p medium settings, native resolution, I'm not seeing any differences in the textures, and the 5060 Ti is hitting 64 FPS average with 1% lows of 54. The 9060 XT is 11% faster, hitting 71 FPS. Now, 11% faster is kind of somewhat noticeable, but it's not mind-blowing. I would say the main difference here is that the 9060 XT could play the game at maximum settings, including ray tracing, and the 5060 Ti can't. You're forced to downgrade the graphics settings on cards that are otherwise powerful enough to run it at maximum settings, just because of the lack of VRAM. At 1080p medium settings, we could also turn on FSR and DLSS at the quality setting, and now we're getting 84 FPS versus 77. The 9060 XT is 9% faster. It's not mind-blowing. So again here, I think the biggest difference in this game was the settings you're able to use. Now, if we go up to 1440p max settings, even the 9060 XT is having a bit of trouble here. We're only averaging 43 FPS. The 5060 Ti is only hitting 17, so that's pretty awful. But it's not like the 9060 XT is doing amazingly well here. However, if you go ahead and use balanced level upscaling, and FSR 4 looks perfectly usable at 1440p at the balanced setting, unlike FSR 3, which I would be very hesitant to use this aggressively. Here, that gets the 9060 XT up to 56 FPS average, which is perfectly playable, whereas the 5060 Ti is still choking on VRAM. Look at that frame time graph. It's spiky mess. Its 1% lows are at 8. And the 9060 XT is now completely playable here. Again, missing textures. If we turn down to medium settings at 1440p, now the 5060 Ti is doing okay. We're at 8% lead for the 9060 XT at 54 versus 50. And we could turn on FSR and DLSS at the balanced mode. Now things are even closer. The 9060 XT is only leading by 3%. You wouldn't even notice the difference between the two if you weren't running a frame rate counter. 70 FPS versus 68. So both doing fine here. So again, the 5060 Ti 8GB is perfectly playable at the low enough graphics settings, but the 9060 XT does not need to make those compromises, and it is powerful enough for that. What about one of the other most popular games released so far in 2025, with Oblivion Remastered? 1080p max settings, which again includes ray tracing. Hardware ray tracing Lumen at the Ultra preset. Well, the 9060 XT here is only hitting 46 FPS, so it's not amazing. It is a 24% advantage, though, over the 5060 Ti, and an 83% advantage in the 1% lows, and once again, look at the stuttery frame time graph on the right-hand side of the screen. This is once again another game that even at 1080p resolution cannot play maximum settings at 1080p on 8GB of VRAM. But the frame rates aren't amazing on the 9060 XT. However, this game does support FSR 4, and using the quality level FSR 4 up against DLSS quality, we can see that the 9060 XT is now averaging 58 FPS. Honestly, you don't want to get a super high frame rate in this game because you're likely to hit even worse stutters on the CPU side of things, so around 60 FPS is very reasonable here. So maximum settings other than FSR quality, 58 FPS on the 9060 XT, it's completely playable. It's 76% ahead of the 5060 Ti because it is still choking on VRAM. Its frame time graph is awful. Its 1% lows are in the teens. So again, another case where maximum settings perfectly usable on the 9060 XT, but not on the 5060 Ti, completely due to VRAM. If we go down to medium settings, the cards are basically tied. 92 FPS versus 91. It's only a 1 FPS and 1% lead for the 9060 XT. Although check out the 1% lows. It's actually an 85% lead, 76 versus 41. Look at the frame time graphs. It's not as spiky on the right-hand side as it was before, but it is still less smooth than what we're seeing on the AMD side of the screen. Getting more spikes, and notice that AMD card is allocating 10 GB of VRAM and reporting slightly over 8 of usage. So it's possible that the additional VRAM is allowing for more efficient texture swaps and things like that. I'm just speculating. But the 1% lows here are certainly showing it as a smoother experience, even at medium settings on the AMD graphics card. Now, what if we kick on FSR and DLSS at the medium settings? Well, now we're at high frame rates on both GPUs, and actually the 5060 Ti is taking the lead now by 11%. Part of that is the fact that I think that the FSR 4 algorithm is a little bit heavier than the DLSS algorithm, and so there's a little bit more of a performance uplift for DLSS 4 than there is for FSR 4 when used at the same settings in a lot of the games that I've tested. It's not massive, but I think that's what we're seeing here. But notice at the 1% lows and the frame time graphs, we are still seeing slightly more micro stutter on the right-hand side of the screen and a smoother frame time graph on the left, and that leads to a 21% advantage in the 1% lows for the 9060 XT. If we move up to 1440p maximum settings, hardware lumen turned back on for ray tracing, neither GPU is doing very well. The 9060 XT is 146% ahead, but that's only 32 FPS versus 13. So not really the way I think anybody would choose to play the game. But what if we kick on FSR and DLSS balanced? Again, FSR 4 balanced looks fine. And here we're getting 48 FPS. We're still probably below where I would personally choose to play the game. But now I think we would definitely be in completely playable on a variable refresh rate display in this slow-paced type of game. Again, I'd probably turn some things down a bit more from here, but I'd say we're arguably at playable settings, and at these playable settings, it's a 92% advantage for the 9060 XT over the 5060 Ti. Medium settings, we're now averaging around 60 FPS, and the 5060 Ti actually takes the lead by 5%. At 62 FPS versus 59, although once again, a lot more stutters on the frame time graph on the right-hand side of the screen. The 9060 XT takes an 85% lead in the 1% lows. If we go to balanced level upscaling at medium, now it's a 16% lead in the averages for the 5060 Ti, but a 33% lead in the 1% lows for the 9060 XT. Average frame rates here are now very high at 106 versus 91. Now, let's move on to Marvel's Spider-Man 2. At max settings at 1080p, we have yet another game that fails to fit an 8GB VRAM buffer, leading the 5060 Ti only hitting 29 FPS versus the 9060 XT's 57, which once again is absolutely completely playable, 57 FPS, and it's a 97% advantage in the averages and 187% advantage in the 1% lows. What if you kick on FSR and DLSS quality? Well, now you're hitting 78 FPS versus 35. Still a massive lead for the 9060 XT, and it's very, very playable and looks fine using FSR 4 at the quality settings. What if we played at medium settings? Well, now we see that the 5060 Ti is doing okay, and it's now hitting 108 FPS. The 9060 XT is hitting 119, so it's a 10% advantage, but again, not a mind-blowing lead for the 9060 XT, but it's meant to actually be a less expensive graphics card, so there's still that. We'll see if it actually plays out that way in the real-world market. 1% lows are 15% advantage at 71 versus 62. If we kick on FSR and DLSS at the quality settings, we're at 154 versus 145, 6% lead for the 9060 XT. Now, let's check out 1440p max settings. Well, now the 9060 XT is only hitting 40 FPS, so again, it's debatable whether these are settings you'd play at. I would say probably not. And actually, there's potentially some sign that the AMD card is even having some spikes that could be VRAM related. This game uses a lot of VRAM at max settings, and AMD cards tend to allocate more VRAM than Nvidia cards do, so interesting. What if we kicked on FSR and DLSS at the balanced settings? Let me actually go back for a second here. FSR and DLSS balanced, there it is. Actually, okay, there it is. Sorry, guys. So max settings 1440p, FSR, DLSS balanced. 9060 XT is now hitting 54 FPS, which is very, very usable. And that's putting it more than twice as fast as the 5060 Ti at 25. So again, another case where max settings with some upscaling, perfectly playable if you have enough VRAM. 1440p medium is 82 FPS versus 75. The 9060 XT is ahead by 9%. Nothing to write home about, but still nice to have the lead. 1440p medium FSR and DLSS balance, we're now hitting 119 versus 120. The 5060 Ti is 1% ahead. Assassin's Creed Shadows is another top seller for this year, and at 1080p max settings, we're once again over 8GB of VRAM, and I think that's leading to a 22% advantage for the 9060 XT, despite the fact that this is including ray tracing again. Notice every game I've showed so far, max settings do include ray tracing. But you need more than 8GB of VRAM for ray tracing in most games. And 39 FPS, though, not amazing. 40-ish FPS on a controller is not awful, but I'd probably be shooting for higher frame rates. 22% advantage, though, for the 9060 XT. Now, if we use quality level upscaling, so FSR 4 is available again in this game and looks pretty competitive and is usable at the quality settings here. It's now 47 FPS versus 38, 24% advantage for the 9060 XT. Again, not amazingly high frame rate, so I'd probably personally still turn things down a little bit. But I wouldn't have to turn it down much, and certainly wouldn't have to turn down textures or anything like that, where you might need to on the 5060 Ti. Now let's go to 1080p medium settings. And this game can't fully turn off ray tracing, but you can set it to hideout only, in which I don't think this benchmark run is going through the hideout, so I think this is effectively RT off. We're now seeing the 9060 XT ahead by 11% at 83 versus 75. So it still has a lead, but it's dropped due to the 8GB VRAM no longer being an issue. Now if we go to medium settings, but with FSR and DLSS at the quality setting, we're now seeing only a 3% advantage for the 9060 XT at 92 versus 89. If we go to 1440p maximum settings, Again, ultra settings with RT maxed out. The 9060 XT is only good for 31 FPS, so probably not the way you're going to choose to play the game. But we are definitely going over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, contributing to the 24% lead in the averages and 35% lead in the 1% lows. If we kick on FSR and DLSS at the balanced settings, we now see the 9060 XT hit 42 FPS, which again, arguably playable on a controller or something. Probably not the way I'd choose to play the game though. But again, we're definitely over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, contributing to the 24% advantage in the averages and 33% in the 1% lows. If we go ahead and drop to medium settings though, both cards are now hitting over 60 FPS at native 1440p at 67 versus 61, so 10% lead for the 9060 XT. And we could kick on FSR and DLSS balanced, which now brings things up to 81 and 83 respectively. Actually, the 5060 Ti now taking a 2% advantage. Again, I've noticed a lot of times when I kick on DLSS versus FSR4, I think there's that heavier FSR4 algorithm. So when the lead was a little bit low at native for 9060 XT, it lost it once we kicked on upscaling. Now, let's go ahead and switch to a game that is one of the few games that requires ray tracing, and that's going to be Doom: The Dark Ages. So ray tracing is required in this game. It will have a path tracing update as of the time of filming. That update is not out yet. So the maximum settings in the game are Ultra Nightmare, which uses ray tracing but not path tracing. The 8 gigabyte card is struggling here, only hitting 39 FPS, whereas the 9060 XT is just fine at 74, giving it a 90% advantage. However, notice it's just barely allocating over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So this is one of the cases where by kicking on DLSS quality, it gets it just under that 8 gigabyte borderline, and now the 5060 Ti is doing fine. In fact, it's averaging 100 FPS, which basically ties the 9060 XT. However, here's a point where I should mention that the DLSS image looks way better than the FSR image because Vulkan games, which this is, as of the time of filming, my knowledge is they don't. So FSR4 doesn't have Vulkan support. So despite the frame rates being similar here, I would say that that's a big win for the 5060 Ti when it comes to image quality. Now, 1080p native resolution at medium settings is 86 FPS on both, and honestly, the medium settings in this game look very close to the Ultra Nightmare settings. So this would be a reasonable way to play the game on both GPUs. Especially on the AMD hardware, where I would not want to be touching upscaling if I could avoid it due to the FSR4 not being available here. Which is what we're going to see here. This is FSR3 versus DLSS 4, so while AMD takes a 9% lead, I would much rather be playing it on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, I'll also mention that if you're trying to look for the differences that I'm seeing, I've noticed that dark scenes like this one don't survive YouTube compression particularly well. So you may need to take my word for it on this one, given YouTube compression is probably blocking a lot of the fine detail together, causing you to not see the fine detail differences between the upscalers. But look at an FSR3 versus DLSS 4 comparison video, you will see what I'm talking about. 1440p max settings absolutely crush 8 gigabyte cards. It's a 174% advantage for the 9060 XT at 52 versus 19, and this is definitely playable at 52 FPS, even if I'd probably target higher frame rates, which I do by kicking on upscaling, especially on an Nvidia GPU. It's now 82 versus 73, but again, I'd be less likely to use the upscaling on the AMD card. 1440p medium settings, we're now getting 59 and 57 respectively, 4% advantage for the 9060 XT, again, despite this being a ray tracing test. And if we kick on upscaling at balance mode, it's now 97 and 92. Good frame rates on both, but I prefer the image quality on the right-hand side of the screen. So there is that. Now, what about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2? This game is pretty well optimized, but it offers its maximum preset is the experimental settings, which are just absolutely brutal. They also use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM at 1080p, which is why we're seeing the 9060 XT 125% ahead, despite the fact that it is only getting 27 FPS. Now, this game does support both FSR4 and DLSS 4, but the problem is you don't get a lot of frame rate boost out of it on the 9060 XT. I'm only getting to 29. Now, actually, the 5060 Ti isn't getting much frame rate boost from DLSS itself here. Where it's getting the boost from is just we're slightly under 8 gigabytes now. It was slightly over, now it's slightly under, which made all the difference. The 5060 Ti is now hitting 44 FPS, which puts it 52% ahead, which is not particularly great considering by just slightly turning down the graphics settings, you could easily get well over 100 FPS in this game. So I will classify over 40 FPS as it's usable if you wanted to play at maximum settings. Whereas the 29 FPS, though, on the 9060 XT, I don't think really would be that playable. 1080p medium settings, though, and native resolution, you're well over 100 FPS on both GPUs. That being said, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 does seem to be an Nvidia-favored title in performance metrics. So 20% advantage here for the 5060 Ti. Nothing VRAM related. This is just the game runs better on the 50 series hardware. Medium settings with FSR and DLSS at the quality setting. We're seeing an 18% advantage for the 5060 Ti, and we're now hitting really high frame rates, 167 versus 141. Now, at 1440p max settings, neither GPU is usable, although having enough VRAM does give the 9060 XT a large advantage. But again, not particularly usable frame rates on either card. Using FSR and DLSS, this is a typo. This should not say quality, this should say balanced. I'm using balanced at 1440p. I promise that's what the test is. It's a typo. Anyway, 3 times the frame rate on the 9060 XT, but it's not particularly usable because it's 27 FPS versus 9, but it's only 27. Anyway, so max settings just not very usable at 1440p in this game. Let's go ahead and switch to medium settings. Now, medium settings in this game, we're hitting 82 FPS and 96 FPS, so very usable at native 1440p, 17% advantage for the 5060 Ti. If we kick on FSR and DLSS balance, we're now at 135 and 109, giving a 24% advantage to the 5060 Ti, but again, nice high frame rate on both GPUs. This game can run... By the way, look at the frame time graphs, guys. Look how smooth that frame time graph is. Only this game and Doom Eternal, when you have enough VRAM, show me this kind of frame time graph. This is one of the reasons why people talk about optimized games feeling smooth. Look at those frame time graphs. Now we're on to my favorite game released in 2025, which is Clair Obscur Expedition 33. And at 1080p max settings, look at the frame time graph on the 5060 Ti. It's very stuttery when it loads into this area, whereas the AMD card with enough VRAM swapped in everything a lot more efficiently. Now notice that as the run goes on, the 8GB card smooths out, but that initial load into the zone, when you first get going, was going over 8GB of VRAM, and that shows why there's a 44% advantage in the 1% lows for the 9060 XT, even though the averages are only a 1 FPS 2% advantage for the 9060 XT. Now if we kick on DLSS quality, the 1% lows issue goes away, but also we need to talk about something. There's no FSR available in this game. Not at all, not even FSR 3. XeSS is available, and I can set it to the same internal rendering resolution as DLSS, but it doesn't look as good as FSR 4 or DLSS 4. 6% frame rate advantage for the 5060 Ti as well. At 1080p medium settings, we're looking at 84 and 83 FPS. It's basically a tie, slight lead in the 1% lows for the 9060 XT, but both GPUs doing well here. And at medium settings with DLSS and XeSS, we're at 104 and 109. 5% advantage for the 5060 Ti, but also an image quality advantage. Look at things like the leaves on the trees in the background, stuff like that. Looks noticeably better on the right-hand side of the screen. 1440p max settings, neither GPU is doing great, but look at the frame time graph and the 1% lows on the 8GB card. It's getting crushed, but it's not really the settings I'd be using on either GPU, so I don't think it's particularly relevant. But if we use DLSS balanced and set XeSS to the same internal rendering resolution, by the way, look at the stairs right now. You'll see what I mean. A lot more sharp detail on the right-hand side of the screen. It's more blurry and less defined on the left-hand side of the screen. You can also look at as things like the triangle little streamers, the like leaves and branches on the trees in the background. This looks noticeably better on the right-hand side of the screen. Frame rate numbers are only an 8% advantage for the 5060 Ti, but it's a noticeably better image quality at this frame rate, and that is not something that should be ignored, and one of the reasons why I use side-by-side footage in my comparisons, not just bar graphs. Anyway, what if we go ahead and go down to 1440p medium settings? Well, now we're getting, again, basically a tie. We're right under 60 FPS on both, 58 versus 59. Nothing really to write home about. You could totally play the game at these settings. That being said, I'd probably kick on DLSS balanced on the, if I had the Nvidia GPU here, that gets it to 99 FPS at reasonable looking settings here. Medium settings do look pretty good in this game. Again, the AMD GPU can use upscaling as well, but it has to be XeSS. You can mod it with OptiScaler and things like that, but I'm testing out what's available in the games without having to go to third-party mods, etc. Anyway, so better image quality and a 13% performance advantage for the Nvidia GPU in this title. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is another game where AMD hardware seems to be a bit of an afterthought. Not only does it perform way better on Nvidia here, it's a 23% advantage at native max settings 1080p, but notice what happens when I try out upscaling. There's no FSR or XeSS in this game. We're stuck with TAAU from Unreal Engine 4, and it does not look good. Look at the grass and the plants. Look at objects disoccluded in motion. It's very ugly on the left-hand side of the screen. And this is just unfortunately one of the things you have to deal with sometimes on the AMD hardware. It's often just less supported with its feature set. Things are getting better, but they're not perfect. DLSS is far more supported in far more games. 1080p medium settings, it's a 21% advantage for the 5060 Ti, and I'm not gonna show medium settings with upscaling because this game has a 120 FPS cap, and we're already right near that at times on the Nvidia GPU here, which means that if I used upscaling, it would artificially suppress the Nvidia hardware's performance. So that's why I'm not gonna show that, but I've otherwise showed that for other games. 1440p max settings, it's a 14% advantage for the 5060 Ti. By the way, the frame time graphs just look ugly in this game all the time for all GPUs. Anyway, if we use upscaling though, here we're seeing a 29% advantage for the 5060 Ti, and also again a huge image quality advantage for the 5060 Ti due to TAAU just not looking anywhere near as good as DLSS, especially in motion. Look at Cloud's arms as he's running, for example. Look at how pixelated it is on the left-hand side of the screen. At 1440p medium settings, it's 82 versus 69. While 69 is nice, it's not as nice as 82. Specifically, 82 is 19% better. Anyway, we can also kick on upscaling, which once again, look at Cloud's arms and sword in motion here. The edges are very pixelated, disoccluded objects are very pixelated, whereas it looks very usable on the right-hand side of the screen. 99 FPS versus 91, so 9% faster for the 5060 Ti, but image quality is noticeably better. And that is all of the tests that I ran at the same settings on these two GPUs. So let's pop out for some final thoughts and some additional bar graphs. So, bar graph 1, all of the tests. So when we look at something like this, what is going on here? So again, AMD won in by far more of the tests because when testing the newest games, even at 1080p resolution, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not usually enough for maximum settings. That being said, at medium settings, the performance advantages tend to swing kind of either way. Also kind of interesting when looking at this is that the average is that the 9060 XT is 20% faster. Now, which I don't think is actually how much faster its GPU is. It's just that it has a massive lead when we're over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and then it wins some and it loses some when we're not over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So I really think we need to break down these results into some separate slides. So that's what we're gonna do next. Next thing we're gonna look at though is just take the same slide but sort it from biggest advantage for the 9060 XT versus biggest advantage for the 5060 Ti. We can see the 5060 Ti does get some big wins, specifically Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, when we were at the experimental settings. Using DLSS quality, because if we weren't, it was actually a win for the 9060 XT because we were over 8 gigabytes of VRAM. Now that was only hitting 44-ish FPS. Now some of AMD's big wins though also weren't getting super high frame rates either. So that is something to keep in mind. But we did notice, and go back to the side-by-sides if you need to, Many times, the maximum settings were very usable on the 9060 XT, so they were not at all unrealistic settings to use, especially if we allow for upscaling. And when FSR4 was available, it looked quite good and very comparable, if maybe not quite as good as DLSS 4. It's very usable. But my biggest issue with the FSR4 was its unavailability in some games that had DLSS. And that was a problem, and I think that's going to be my biggest hang-up on AMD hardware. That being said, though, let's look at this. I think I'd still definitely recommend the 9060 XT heartily over the 5060 Ti 8GB if they're around the same price. Also, let's look at ray tracing, because this is interesting. The 5060 Ti, despite being Nvidia's good at ray tracing, did not get a single win in any of my ray tracing tests. And I had a lot of ray tracing tests in this video, because it turns out ray tracing is available in most new games. The maximum settings in most of the games I just tested that released in 2025 had ray tracing available. However, all of the games that had ray tracing available, besides some of the Doom Dark Ages tests, used more than 8GB of VRAM, leading to the 9060 XT actually averaging 59% faster in my ray tracing tests. In reality, I think it's actually more comparable in ray tracing performance, and heavier ray tracing workloads, Nvidia might even have the advantage if it had enough VRAM to run it, which the 8GB card didn't. Anyway, so interesting that the 9060 XT is actually 59% faster in my ray tracing tests. Now, what if we do no ray tracing? Now, this is kind of interesting, because if I remove my ray tracing tests, I'm removing most of my maximum settings tests. And if I do that, now this is basically a tie. I have the 9060 XT only 0.3% faster. But I think what we're really looking at here is primarily looking at mostly testing medium settings. Some of these are max settings, but like I said, most of the max settings in these games involved ray tracing. So I think it might make more sense to sort things by max settings versus medium settings. And also maybe by rendering resolution, 1080p or 1440p. So this is all of my 1080p maximum settings results. Most of them use ray tracing, some of them don't. It's just maximum settings in any given game at 1080p. The 9060 XT comes out 31% faster on average, because a lot of times the maximum settings, even at 1080p, went over 8GB of VRAM. Now, we can see that the 5060 Ti did get a few wins, notably using, by the way, my 1080p results are including both native and quality level upscaling. Because I think it is very reasonable to use quality level upscaling with upscalers as good as DLSS 4 and FSR 4. Anyway, so with that in mind, there was a couple of wins for the 5060 Ti, but the majority of the wins were for the 9060 XT, and by a wide margin when we were spilling over VRAM. But what if we tested out just medium settings at 1080p, both native and with upscaling quality? Well, now, interestingly, the 5060 Ti 8GB is 2% faster. In the end, I'd actually call it a tie. But really what it is AMD gets a few more wins, but when the Nvidia won, it tended to be by a wider margin. Specifically, Final Fantasy VII and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 were both Nvidia-favored titles, whereas the other games were more even or a little bit AMD-favored. It comes out to a 2% faster result for the 5060 Ti, but in the end, what I would really say here is it's pretty much a tie. So in other words, I think if you're just looking for what is the raw power of the two GPUs when you're not VRAM constrained, and this is the best slide for answering that question. They're basically tied, but one will win in one game, one will win in another. So this is an interesting slide if you're somebody who mostly, if you're like, you just tested all these big new AAA games and I only play old games and esports. This is probably the slide that is your best answer for old games and esports. Those are games that are probably not going over 8GB of VRAM, and that means that the two cards are probably going to roughly average out to about the same performance, but in individual games, you'll see one take a lead over the other. Now, what about 1440p? Because I think this level, if you're spending almost $400 on a graphics card, I think targeting 1440p is perfectly reasonable, especially if you intend to use some level of upscaling. So this is native 1440p maximum settings and balanced level upscaling, again at maximum settings. We'll also look at medium settings, but let's take a longer look at maximum settings for a second. At 1440p max settings, combining native and balanced level upscaling, the 9060 XT is 62% faster on average. But again, that's really just saying that the 8 gigabyte card just doesn't have enough VRAM for these settings. There's a few games where it does, and that's the few places where it gets some wins. Now, what if we sorted out to 1440p medium settings? And again, including both native results and balanced level upscaling results. Here, now you see it's, win some and you lose some. It's averaging out to the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte being 3% faster in this particular set of games, but I would read that as it's basically a tie. And if you tested a different set of games, you could probably swing it 3% the other way or have it come out dead even. The point is, if you're within the 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, which you can be even at 1440p, then it's really about the same power level. So what is the final takeaway from all of this? Well, my final takeaway is that the 9060 XT does have the VRAM and the performance to run the newest games at maximum settings, especially if you're willing to use quality level upscaling, but sometimes even native runs fine at max settings on the 9060 XT at 1080p. At 1440p, we were often seeing balanced level upscaling being required to get to around 60 FPS, but at otherwise maximum settings. And when FSR 4 is available, it looks pretty good at balanced at 1440p output in the newest games. So here's the thing. These cards, when is it important to have more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM? And I would say when the graphics card is powerful enough to run games at settings that require more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And we've established here that these two GPUs have a very similar performance level when there's no VRAM constraint. But we've also established that the newest games in 2025 often do go well over 8 gigabytes of VRAM, and these cards are powerful enough to use that extra VRAM, which makes me completely unable to recommend buying the 5060 Ti 8 gigabyte, despite the fact that it's supposed to be even more expensive if we're looking at I think MSRP as well as real world pricing compared to the 9060 XT. Now, my main caveat in this review is we haven't yet seen the actual real world pricing of the 9060 XT. But I will say that as long as it's under $400 in the real world market, it is going to be the choice to make instead of the 8 gigabyte 5060 Ti. My general thoughts are, AMD instead of Nvidia, yes, I'd rather have DLSS, but games that have FSR 4 support, it looks pretty great. You can mod it with Optiscaler and things like that into games that don't have it, but that's a really annoying hassle. And that's my biggest hang-up right now for AMD hardware, is that I would like FSR 4 to just be available in every new release. If that starts happening, I'm much less hung up on things. Nvidia tends to be more on the forefront of developing new features and things like that, and I think that'll probably continue. But you know what? If you're thinking about future-proofing, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not the way to go. So, yeah, there's some Nvidia feature set advantages. We should probably talk about frame generation as well. AMD has frame generation, but it's a ×2 mode, and I can think the image quality is sometimes not quite as good as the image quality on Nvidia's frame generation, although it's fairly usable on both. So the ×3 and ×4 frame gen mode, is that enough of a selling point to buy the 5060 Ti? Maybe I'll just play stuff in the background while I'm talking. Is that enough reason to buy the 5060 Ti instead of the AMD hardware that has all the VRAM and stuff like that? And a couple of thoughts. One is frame generation uses VRAM. So you're already on a VRAM constrained card. So it's not gonna solve a problem that was caused by a lack of VRAM when it takes additional VRAM to use. Also, both cards have ×2 frame gen. And I think frame gen is best used when you're at around 60 FPS. Some people are more tolerable going down to lower frame rates, but think about that. ×2 mode gets you to around 100 FPS plus. And I think a lot of people buying $400 graphics cards might be on monitors that aren't insanely high refresh rate monitors. If you're on a monitor that's in the 120, 144, maybe even 165 hertz, then the ×2 frame gen mode is already getting you near your monitor's max, and there's no reason to go over your max frame rate on your monitor using frame generation. ×3 and ×4 mode are more appropriate to 200 hertz plus monitors. We're talking 240 hertz monitors, well then 60 ×4 is 240. See what I'm saying, right? So the point is, frame generation does not give you increased performance. It gives you more motion fluidity at a trade-off to a bit of latency and image quality. That doesn't mean it's not worth using, and it doesn't mean that having a ×3 or ×4 mode isn't a nice feature to have. But the AMD card already has a ×2 mode, which is pretty good to get you over 100 hertz from a reasonable base frame rate. And it just has more VRAM. And we've established that that is very, 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 very worthwhile in the newest games. And like I said, these are the games that are coming out in 2025. If you buy this card now, you're probably buying some games that come out in 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029. By then, we probably have the next console generation, which is usually when we see big jumps in VRAM usage in games, because a lot of times their primary graphic development is around the new console generation. So for all of those reasons, I don't think spending almost $400 on an 8GB graphics card in 2025 makes a lot of sense. The 9060 XT is meant to cost less, but even if it ends up costing about the same, I think it's a better buy. If you're still screaming at the screen that I should have compared it against the 16GB version of the 5060 Ti, I did, but it's going to be its own separate video. Because that's really talking about, is it worth spending more money to get the 5060 Ti at the same VRAM capacity, rather than deciding what this video is about, which is, what's the best graphics card around $400? Anyway, hope you found the video useful and or interesting. Stay tuned to the channel for more videos like this. I'll be doing tons of side-by-sides constantly with these GPUs, with other GPUs. I'm retesting all of my GPUs in these new 2025 games. Head-to-heads constantly. Enjoy. Stay tuned to the channel if you're interested. Hope you all have an excellent day.